So, Jonathan, you know, where I live, Berlin, Germany, there's this unique phenomenon, which I haven't found in many other places in the world, where you can go to any large supermarket, pick up a loaf of bread, and you can put it through the slicing machine, and it slices your bread fresh for you.
My sense of that is that they used to have those machines in bakeries in Britain, but no longer bother.
Well, Germany still does. And guess what else you can do? Again, you probably had this in the UK, but not anymore.
Yeah.
Especially this one here is made for a big grocery.
So you and I, we went to Markönig in Hamburg.
Yeah.
They are our partner sponsor for the series.
They are.
They make grinders for professionals, home baristas.
Almost every German supermarket has this corner.
And Ansgar, one of their product managers, explained that they also have a coffee grinder for supermarkets.
And then you can grind by yourself the coffee in different grind sizes directly into the bag.
Literally, just pick up a bag of coffee off the supermarket shelf.
I will turn it on now.
Open the bag in the store and then dump it in the grinder.
Done.
That was fast. That was very, very fast.
So very, very fast because this motor is running with almost 1,700 RPMs.
But Jonathan, you know what is the most interesting thing for me about this grinder?
What is it?
It's a name. Guatemala.
We called our products, came from the origin. That's why we called it Guatemala.
Right, so they named some of their coffee grinders after places where coffee is grown. And in this case, they chose Guatemala, which on the face of it is kind of strange. They could have chosen to call this grinder Brazil, but they chose to call it Guatemala, even though Guatemala, it's not a major coffee producing country like Brazil.
That is no accident. You know, Markönig are based in Germany, in Hamburg, and Germany and Guatemala, you know, have a very special connection.
Yes, they do. A very special connection because, for example, when we were in Hamburg, you picked up some Guatemalan beans.
Correct.
And we brewed it up as a V60. And when we looked at the label, we noticed that the name of the producer from Guatemala, it wasn't a Latino name. This is a German name.
Yes, it's a very Germanic name.
We're not going to name the producer, but it had the same kind of Germanic sounding ring to it as a name like Heinz Schmidt. And that is kind of the story we're going to be exploring.
That is exactly the story that we want to explore. So, I mean, James, we're going to explore the history of coffee in Guatemala in this episode. You know, it's not just a story of colonial imperial extraction. In fact, what this is above all is a story of what happens after the country becomes independent, after the Spanish rulers of the country have left.
And to give you fair warning, dear listener, this is quite a dark story.
It is. But it's an important story, you know, because when you look at a coffee bag, you see something on the bag that says 5th generation coffee producer, a family farm. Oh, well, if it comes from Guatemala or it comes really from many bits of Central America, it might not be quite as simple as that.
Might actually be a signal for a more uncomfortable truth. And we really want to thank Markönig for supporting us to tell this kind of story.
We can tell this story, which I think is very important for the coffee community to hear, and we can create this free educational resource because of receiving our sponsorship. So thanks to Markönig for making that possible.
I'm James Harper, creator of Filter Stories, a coffee documentary podcast.
And I'm Jonathan Morris, professional historian and author of the book Coffee: A Global History. And this is A History of Coffee, the story of how a psychoactive seed changed the world and continues to shape our lives today.
This is our third series on the history of coffee, and in this episode, we're tackling the uncomfortable history of Guatemala and coffee.
Who owns the rich volcanic soils, and who is forced to work them? Whose land is it anyway? James, you know, Guatemala, obviously, before the Europeans came along, it's inhabited by indigenous people, the Mayans. And obviously, even today, there are some places that are still very much Mayan.
Yes. For example, the town of Jacaltenango. It's in the northern part of Guatemala, near the border with Mexico, in the region of Huehuetenango, which you'll often find written on many coffee bags. And I actually had a great conversation with somebody who grew up in the town of Jacaltenango.
So I am Juan Jose Lopez. I am a PhD candidate in anthropology, and I study like coffee, multi-species relationships.
And Juan Jose's town of Jacaltenango sounds like an extraordinary place.
You are encircled by mountains, and then you have like a triangle in which you can see like lowlands, and that's looking to Mexico and Chiapas lowlands.
And Juan Jose's family have been living here in Jacaltenango for longer than anyone can remember.
So they have been in Jacaltenango, I think, forever, right? There is not like a story of how they got to this place.
Even today, they see themselves as Jacaltecos first.
Like, you know, people have come here to say that we are indigenous, that we are Maya, but we have been always been Jacaltecos.
Jacaltenango, it's almost entirely populated by indigenous people with long roots in that area.
And once upon a time, that was a story for all of Guatemala.
Yeah, indeed. Obviously, prior to the arrival of the Spanish, you know, the whole of Guatemala is populated by indigenous peoples living in very different societies. But in order to understand more about that history, we brought in somebody we both know and I've worked with quite a bit, Professor Ted Fisher.
My name's Ted Fisher. I'm a professor of anthropology at Vanderbilt University, which is in Nashville, Tennessee. I've been working in Guatemala since the early 1990s, and my latest book is Making Better Coffee, How Mayan Farmers and Third World Tastemakers Create Value.
All right, so Ted, my first question for you is, if we were to rewind the clock 600 years before the Spanish, before Europeans come along, can you paint a picture of who's living in Guatemala, and in particular, how they manage the land?
So many different languages spoken. Some of these are kingdoms. There are some big cities, but mostly they're small communities. They had this system of agriculture, we call it milpa agriculture, where they would cut down land, they would plant crops, and it was a particular group of crops. Corn was the staple, maize was the staple, and beans and squash and tomatoes and chilies and things like that. And it was seen as alive. The land is actually a living being, and we offer sacrifices to it, and it gives to us, and we have this cycle of reciprocity. And one thing that's really different, and that sometimes it's hard for us to wrap our Western minds around, because we think of property in a very particular kind of way. And it was different back then. The sense of private property wasn't there. Most land was communally owned. It would be allocated and reallocated from year to year.
Right.
To gain prestige in these communities, it was generally the people who gave away the most, who were the most generous to the community. So they weren't necessarily the wealthiest, or they did really well, but they gave all of what they earned away. And that would create this prestige.
Wow.
What Ted's saying is we have collectively organised communities who work the land commonly together. They might change the partition of the land from year to year as to who looks at which bit, but essentially it's not really seen as a private resource, it's seen as a communal resource.
Mm-hmm.
So this is that indigenous structure. Then, 1524, we have the arrival of colonizers from Europe, the Spanish.
They're gold hungry, they're silver hungry. The cities that there are, they take them over, and They would hold the leaders hostage and demand so much jade or gold. And the gold that they would demand, and there was some gold around, but it wasn't like these huge quantities that we think about in Peru and other places. Yeah, so it was just really extraction.
But hold on, Jonathan. There are very few Spanish. They are totally outnumbered. How did they get away with this?
They had gunpowder. The other thing that they had is disease. They brought with them a whole range of, as it were, common European diseases that obviously were unknown in Guatemala. And that actually wiped out more of the native population, probably, than actually the bloodshed itself. So, I mean, James, obviously today we have vaccines. We're not exposed to life-threatening diseases anymore. But back then, many more people are going to die from disease rather than die from old age. And of course, James, here's an interesting fact to you. There are obviously equally diseases in Guatemala to which the Spanish had never been exposed that were very deadly to them. And as you know, you and I, we went together to Guatemala to present at a conference. You think about the Spanish capital that we visited.
Antigua.
And what was the amazing thing about Antigua?
It's a giant square.
It's an absolute giant square. The whole of Antigua is constructed on that sort of square way with all these square roads, as it were, to make sure the wind goes through, to try and disperse what they thought would be the disease-bearing miasmas and so forth.
Interesting. Let's just return to the story. So the Spanish have turned up.
Spanish, yeah, they turn up, they hold people hostage, they're extracting what they can. But the fact is, they've miscalculated. There isn't really that much gold. So this isn't really something they can extract. But what they do find is a bug, the cochineal. And this bug produces a red dye, and that becomes the basis for red dye in Europe. So instead of demanding gold, they demand that people give them cochineal.
So they're demanding this insect, which produces this red dye. But the Spanish, it doesn't sound like they are owning the land. It's still indigenous land that they're demanding things from.
The Spanish concentrate into armed military bases in the cities.
Right.
Around them is the countryside. That's the huge, big expanse of Guatemala. That's where there are those indigenous people. But what they're telling them to do is give them tribute, such as bringing in those insects for them to then export. So the indigenous people, as it were, are still settled on the land, and there's no sort of Spanish land ownership. But everything changes in the 19th century. First of all, the then colony of Guatemala declares independence from Spain. And then, towards the mid-century, the cochineal industry basically collapses as Europeans develop synthetic dyes back in Europe.
So let's explore the Guatemalan independence story. What happens?
The end of the Spanish Empire is caused by the Spanish settler population.
Right.
It's the settler population who are no longer prepared to be part of that empire for various reasons, but in essence, it's about self-government.
And this is the same story in America, right? Where American settlers, they declare independence from the British monarchy in the late 1700s. They're like, we are our own country. Why are we taking orders from some faraway European country?
Effectively, that is indeed the same thing that what happens basically in Guatemala too.
Right, so Guatemala is independent in 1821. So then who's really running the place?
So we often talk about 20 families in Guatemala, and these are families that are very cognizant of their bloodlines and their ties to Spain and the whiteness of their skin. And then you have by some counts, a majority indigenous population, and then this mixed, I hate to use the language, right? But this population that was called Ladinos, who were Spanish, Maya, Guatemalan. And so you had these three layers, and the elite elites were really kind of running things behind the scenes. They weren't president or anything. And then the Ladinos who aligned with the Western side of things.
Right. So these Spanish descendant elites, they're running the place. What do they want for their Guatemala?
Among the elites, there was this notion that Guatemala should be a real nation. And by real nation, they were thinking France, Germany, England, something like that, a modern country. And what's holding us back are all these indigenous peoples. And, we're too enlightened to slaughter them, but as good economic liberals, we can privatize their land and, in a very generous way, say we nudge them or we pull them into this system and make them modern.
And now comes the second piece, James.
Mm-hmm.
There's a collapse in the cochineal industry.
Mm-hmm.
The Guatemalans, at the same time, that settler population, they want to modernize their economy, create a new export industry to replace cochineal, and they decide to do it with coffee.
Why coffee?
Well, as we know, there's one fundamental thing about coffee. You can't replace coffee from something in Europe, something that we've already observed in our surrogates episode. In other words, coffee has to be grown only in tropical areas. So coffee is, in that sense, a pretty good investment. But there is a problem. If you're going to do this, you've got to need people with money and capital that they're going to be prepared to invest to create that industry.
And coming up next, how Guatemala transformed itself into a coffee-growing powerhouse. So, in the later 1800s, the Guatemalan elites, they want to modernize the country. They want to grow coffee. But they have a problem. There just aren't enough elites, and they themselves don't have enough money to really transform the entire country. So Ted, what do?
They decided that we can import people to help us with this. And who better than the Germans? They're white, they're super white, so it's going to lighten up the population. They're engineers. They build factories. So looking on into the future, when we become a real nation that has factories, we need these kind of people. And they can bring that expertise now with coffee processing machinery. And so they very explicitly had a program of, let's get Germans to come here. There were conventions between Guatemala and Hamburg, basically giving Germans carte blanche, even at one point, immunity from prosecution in Guatemala.
Wow. Basically saying, you can do whatever the hell you want in our country.
Yep.
And why would Germans choose to move?
Well, the obvious answer is money. They want to make money, cultivate fame.
My favorite example is this Hamburg man, Erwin Paul Dieseldorf. And he was a second son of a trading family. And his father sent him at like 17 to go to an uncle in London and work in his trading house. And then he wanted to make his own name for the family, but also for himself. So he made his way to Guatemala, was able to play on some family and friendship ties and borrow a little money and buy some land. So he goes to this area of Guatemala called Coban. It's a little removed from Guatemala City and the cosmopolitan urban life there. But coffee was really starting to boom, and so there was some money.
Right.
He was one of the main players there. You can still buy Dieseldorf coffee today.
Wow. Okay, so Dieseldorf, he buys this land, but I would imagine that this land is indigenous land, right? Cultivated by indigenous communities. So how does that work?
In very simple terms, James, the government uses its own legal system to declare it owns the land, takes it away from the indigenous people, and then sells it on to those settlers.
Communal land was considered unused or fallowed land, right? These rotating cycles of milpa agriculture require a few years of fallowness between.
Right.
And it can happen kind of shockingly fast. I mean, the surveyors show up in a community where the majority of people are illiterate, much less conversant in the law, and have people put fingerprints on pieces of paper and stuff. It still happens today.
Yeah, that's scary.
So, James, I think we want to highlight one thing here within the story, okay? The majority of the land that the government gives away is, unsurprisingly, the easy accessible, the very fertile, the low-lying land, the land that's easily accessible from their own cities. That's the land they target. So the indigenous population living on that land definitely lose their land. However, land that was more inaccessible, more mountainous, further away from the centres of population, those were the places where you might see indigenous peoples continue to occupy the communal lands.
And that actually goes back to Juan Jose, who we heard from earlier. His town, Jacaltenango, it is so far away. It is so mountainous, so hard to cultivate, that Juan Jose mentions that this is what saved them and allowed that land to stay in his community.
Because it was considered a faraway place, then most of the major city town halls were managed by the same people, which was indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
So this change is really important because it allowed them to actually safeguard their land, right? To create titles, be owners of their land, and that safeguard their land in a context of dispossession.
Okay, so across Guatemala, we have so much dispossession, right? Indigenous land being sold to settlers, many German settlers coming along to cultivate coffee. Okay, but what about the labor? Who's going to do the hard work of cultivating the coffee trees?
Well, surprise, surprise, James, that's going to be the indigenous people.
But how did they get indigenous people to work this land? Was it high wages?
Effectively, the Guatemalan government introduces laws that force the indigenous peoples to work on the land, usually for certain portions of the year, at the direction of the authorities.
So the government effectively forced the indigenous people to do it.
Exactly.
The state could assign them to do things like road repair, and they did, or they could assign them to work on coffee plantations or something like that. So aligned were the economic elites and the political state that the state saw it in its best interest to essentially give free subsidized labor to these German plantation owners.
But Jonathan, hold on. They were really getting paid nothing?
The point is, in practice, what this is, it's trapping people in a cycle of debt and poverty. So they're paying them very little.
Yeah. And that chimes with what Juan Jose told me. From his perspective, the way people suffered in this system was similar to slavery.
So most of the people that were kicked off their land, I will say they just ended up being laborers of plantations, right? Under really severe conditions, which I will say it even resembled like what was happening in slave societies, right? It was a very terrible situation for them.
Okay, so here we have sets of laws which strip indigenous people of their land and then force them to work, which is slavery in all but name. What if you were indigenous, though, and you decided, no, I'm not going to do this?
You can get thrown in jail. There has to be a serious penalty about it. These were not popular laws.
Did anybody resist?
Subtle resistance, what we in the social sciences sometimes call weapons of the weak, where workers would pretend not to understand something or act like they were less capable than they actually are. But there was also active protest. On the Dieseldorf plantation, there were several strikes. Dieseldorf, he had a nemesis, this Maya guy named Jose Angel Aiko. And Dieseldorf, man, hated him. He was like, he's hypnotizing all of my Mayan workers to think that they're being exploited. He helped organize these strikes and was ultimately jailed and died not long after he was released from jail.
Right. Yeah. So the system crushed him. Quick aside, that German plantation owner, Dieseldorf, he is a fascinating character. He, on the one hand, is part of a system that caused so much suffering to the indigenous people of Guatemala. And yet, at the same time, he's a pioneer in the study of Mayan culture.
I mean, he's often portrayed in history and the social sciences as really a demon. I do not want to excuse any of his behavior. He did awful things. But he was also fascinated by Mayan culture. He did studies and published books.
As ever, people are complex, and I'm going to be writing an article in the coffee magazine Standard about Dieseldorf and showing to the extent that I can how he made sense of the fact that he was, on the one hand, impoverishing the indigenous community, yet at the same time admiring their culture. That article will come out towards the end of 2026, and there's a link to Standard, the magazine, in the show notes. Anyway, returning to the story. You know how we heard earlier how up in Juan Jose's town of Jacaltenango, although the indigenous community still owned that land, I was surprised to learn that they were actually required to work as laborers in this system as well. They were forced to come down from the mountains and work on the plantations.
And Jacaltenango and Huehuetenango is also seen like a reservoir of labor. So they are seeing it just specifically as a space to extract labor for the coffee harvest and also like for developing infrastructure for linking these plantations to the ports.
And I learned from Juan Jose how what happened here, this dispossession of land and then forcing the indigenous to then work on the plantations, the long-term effects of this are still felt today. But there is a contrast. There's a contrast between those people who lost their lands down in the lowlands. There is a difference between them and the people in Juan Jose's community up in Jacaltenango who kept their land. They were still forced to work as laborers, but because they kept their land, today they're in a much, much better position financially.
Just the difference between owning land and taking your land from you is still like present today.
The indigenous who lost their land in the lowlands of Guatemala, they got pushed into a cycle of debt and poverty, which even today, if they wanted to migrate to the USA illegally to work and earn better money, they can't even afford to do that.
Even the possibility of migrating doesn't even exist because you are so poor that you cannot even invest for migrating somewhere else, right?
The $5,000 it takes to get to the American border.
You are not even close because you don't have anything in order to put like as a collateral for if you would to take out money.
Coming up next, we look at how the Germans fare in Guatemala and the war this all leads to.
Okay, so James, what we've heard as we get into now the sort of the 1900s, we've moved from a position of having a Guatemala as a colony owned by the Spanish to the point where the settlers themselves have declared independence.
Yep.
But then following the collapse of Cochineal, they've basically removed the indigenous population from many of their commonly owned lands and invited in settlers, new settlers, primarily German settlers, to plant those up with coffee to recreate an export industry.
And using indigenous labor.
Using the labor of those very people whose lands they have removed from them.
And condemning them, most of them, intergenerational poverty. But Jonathan, I want to quickly just touch here on the German side of the story, right? Because here we have many of the plantation owners in Guatemala who are German. And so how much of the industry do Germans control at this point?
At the end of the 19th century, German families were responsible for 80% of the coffee that was exported from Guatemala.
Wow. 80%. And what about the other side? Like, how much of the coffee that Germany is drinking comes from Guatemala?
After Brazil, Guatemala is the next biggest import. But Ted suggests that there could also be a kind of a flavor reason that people in Germany like Guatemalan coffee.
The Germans were noted early on as having a taste for high quality coffee. And most of the coffee at the time was produced in Brazil. And to the German palate, the Brazilian coffee was inferior, and the Guatemalan washed Arabicas were superior.
Another thing to mention, of course, here is connecting back to our first episode when we saw how Hamburg, developed the coffee exchange, partly because of those deep German connections across the coffee trade. Those German families are involved in every aspect. You might have members of the family who are out there growing coffee, shipping coffee, and then you've got trading families who are importing it and companies roasting it. And so if a German plantation owner in Guatemala saw that bad weather was affecting their harvest, then they're going to report that back to their family in Germany, quite often part of the same trading family, as it were. And that gets over to the Hamburg exchange. They know before anybody else. That gives them an advantage in the coffee market. So you get this whole sort of chain of connections.
Right. And so given all of this, when Malkoenig thinks about what kind of grinder are we going to name after a coffee producing country? Of course, it's going to be Guatemala.
Yeah, exactly.
But what I'm curious to know here, back in Guatemala, here we have this enormously profitable coffee export business dominated by German families in this extremely unequal system, right? Where we have the indigenous people living in poverty and this land-owning settler class who is making very good money. And so what does that do to a society when you have the settler class making just fabulous profits and the workers trapped in poverty?
A Marxist historian would say it would lead to the civil war that started in Guatemala in the 1960s.
Okay.
It is a highly unequal place, one of the most unequal places in the world. And you feel it when you're there. You feel it and you see it. And so today, these people live in Guatemala City in gated mansions with serious security staffs. They fly by helicopter to the plantation house periodically, sometimes spend some time there and play farmer, and then fly back out. They can tell you about the best new bakery in Paris more than they could tell you about the communities where they own land.
Incredibly unequal place. And as you say, some historians say this inequality creates the conditions for the Guatemalan Civil War, which actually only came to an end 30 years ago. Tell me about the Civil War. How do we get there?
What got solidified in the 20th century, sugar and bananas became the other big export crops, and particularly bananas.
Green gold, the largest banana plantations in the world.
And so you had this system that was based around exporting plantation crops that relied on super cheap labor.
Native workers attacked the enemy tropical undergrowth, machetes to the right of them, machetes to the left of them. These tireless workers cut their way through a tropical wilderness to conquer the soil for the new banana plantation.
Guatemala, the Banana Republic, a major exporter of bananas, coffee, sugar. More than half of its citizens are Indian. More than 80% of them suffer from malnutrition. For most of this century, they've been ruled by military dictatorships. However, Guatemala knew a brief period of democracy. 1950, Jacobo Arbenz is elected president. Arbenz implements a campaign promise, land reform, returning unused land to the peasants.
Guatemala está muy atrasada.
Guatemala was a very backward country, based on a colonial, almost feudal system. One of the first things that my father, Colonel Jacobo Arbenz, did as president was to bring in reforms to modernize farming. America's United Fruit Company, which had enormous economic power in Guatemala at the time, didn't like the changes. They became very upset when they saw that their monopoly was being affected. This was the time of the Cold War, so they took advantage of this to label my father a communist, which was totally untrue. And that's how they promoted and justified the idea of an invasion.
By 1954, Guatemala was well on its way to becoming the first full-fledged member of the communist bloc on this side of the Atlantic. It was then the United States provided the moral and material means for the temporary removal of communism from the Western Hemisphere.
1954. U.S. officials meet with Guatemalan military leaders. A coup d'etat is devised.
A communist conspiracy was invented. Soviet intervention was decried, proclaimed. The CIA armed Castillo Armas, and with the full backing of the CIA, with planes, with arms, Castillo Armas invaded Guatemala from Honduras, and the democratic experiment came to an end in Guatemala.
My father resigned as president, 1954.
I have taken a momentous decision for our country in the hope that it will halt the invasion and bring peace back to Guatemala.
The US put in a pro-American military dictator who was happy to crush all of the opposition.
Arbenz is forced into exile. Members and supporters of the reform government are purged and jailed. Peasants executed as alleged communist sympathizers.
Military dictators then last in power for the best part of 30 years or so. There are resistance to that. There are small armed groups who identify as Marxists, and they operate in predominantly indigenous areas.
Mm-hmm. You had these rebellions that started in Guatemala, and the second rebellion started in the mid-1970s and was more active in Mayan areas, had a lot more Mayan participants.
But as Tate explains to us, that's not necessarily because Mayans believed in Marxism.
They were orthodox Marxists in a way that was hard to fully bring in Mayan culture and beliefs. So there was always a bit of a tenuous relationship.
So where in Guatemala is this rebellion taking place?
Essentially, if you're going to fight any kind of rebellion, you can't do it down in the lowlands because it's easy to get found, it's easy to get caught. You do it up in the mountains where basically you have the possibility of taking shelter where it's hard to find you. And of course, up in the mountains, that's where many of the Mayans were living.
Right. But in any case, in the mountains, there are these armed groups calling themselves Marxists.
The U.S. sees this, and they're like, oh my God. I mean, they're taking over. They should take over, because if we look at the conditions objectively, the people have a reason to join this revolution. And then they're at Mexico.
Right, the dominoes.
Yeah. And so then they're at us. And so the United States reacted with really supporting the Guatemalan government to conduct what has been determined by a UN body as genocide, killing the Mayan population intentionally. And so in the 70s, they conducted scorched earth campaigns against Mayan villages, many of them in coffee-producing areas.
Bueno, el ejército actuó de diferente manera.
And the stories are just so horrific, they almost make me cry recounting them, of babies' heads bashed against the wall, women raped in front of their families, communities herded into the church and it burned down with them in it alive.
La mayoría de las miles de mujeres, cada mujer, cada familia tiene su propia historia. Unos por desaparecido, otros por asesinado. Miles de niñas, de jóvenes fueron violadas por 20, por 30 militares.
Juan Jose told me some stories that he'd heard. At one point, the government wanted to track whether guerrilla fighters were coming in across the border from Mexico. But it was difficult because there were all these mountain villages near the border with indigenous people. And so they just swept through and murdered them.
They just went there and they just tried to kill and disappear everyone.
And this man comes up to us, this short Indian man who was a school teacher there with his students. And we said, we're journalists. And he finally kind of believed us. And he told us a story that he had personally witnessed. And the army came in. And they rounded up all the men, about 4 men, and they arbitrarily assigned them to La Gloria or El Infierno, heaven or hell, completely arbitrarily. Half of them went to heaven, the other half went to hell. The army then shot the half who went to El Infierno, and they ordered the ones who were saved to La Gloria to bury the others. And this man was one of those who had been saved, and he had to bury his fellow townsmen.
And coffee plantations were understandably a flashpoint in this. A number of them were burned down or taken over by rebels. The military saw it as their goal to keep the status quo.
There were coffee plantation owners who were symbolically executed. You kind of saw the identification by the rebels of those big coffee owners as symbolic of the system that was oppressing the population.
"36 years of civil war in which at least 200,000 people were killed.
83% of the victims are indigenous.
James, I mean, this has been a really dark episode, yeah? We've seen how Guatemala was originally inhabited by indigenous people with very sort of communal practices around the land. And then things change dramatically as first the Spanish come in, and then particularly after Guatemala declares independence, because the ruling class of the European descent modernized the country by focusing on coffee as their key export crop, confiscating that communal land, selling it to particularly German origin plantation owners, and making the indigenous communities then work as landless labourers on that land, leaving them in very dire poverty. And the only exceptions are communities that are so high up in the mountains, these kind of indigenous communities far from the centres of settlement, that they retain their land simply because of their geographical isolation. Mm-hmm. And then all of this culminates in that 30-year Guatemalan civil war. And this is the 20th century, James, not long ago, mm-hmm. where hundreds of thousands, vast majority of them indigenous, are massacred as part of an American-backed military campaign that doesn't finish until the 1990s.
Incredible.
Shocking.
But coming up in part 2, in the next episode, with the rise of specialty coffee, this very dark story flips around. Because coffee goes from this tool of oppression to hope, and then to something a bit more complicated.
Yes, James, it's a complicated question because we have to ask ourselves, what do we actually care about when it comes to our own specialty coffee?